What makes Batman Arkham Asylum such a special game? That's the question that we're going to be actually answering in today's video. Before we get into it, consider leaving a like and subscribing, or if you enjoyed the video, do that afterwards, which of course really is up to you. I do hope you enjoyed the video. Before we get into it though, very quickly, I did recently just make, well, relatively recently, it was 2 days ago, I made a poll on the community tab on YouTube, and it's for a Q&A that I'm going to be making. Probably it should be out by the end of this week, or heading into next week, I hope. So if you have any questions, please leave them. As of now, I think I have around 7 questions, which is still not bad at all, and I want to thank all of you who left a question. But if you have one for me, it doesn't have to be to do with games or the channel. It can be about literally anything. Please leave it there. If you've already asked a question but you want to ask another question, or another 4, I really don't mind. Leave them there and I will try to answer every single one. But not even try, I definitely will answer every question. But for those who aren't interested in that and you just clicked on the video because you like Arkham Asylum, let's just get straight into it. So why is Batman Arkham Asylum such a great game? Well, I want to break this video up into a couple of parts. So to begin with, we're going to talk about the before. That's not great English, but like before the game came out. Then we're going to talk about the game's impact. We're going to talk about the actual gameplay itself. We'll talk about how the game was received. We'll talk about, sort of towards the end of the video, we'll also talk about maybe just a couple of negatives, things that could be improved on, things that the game did really, really well that sort of solidified as one of the best superhero games of all time. Personally, my favorite superhero game of all time. And finally, we'll look at how the actual game holds up today. Is it still as good as the other Arkham games, or is it, seen as easily like the weakest one because of when it came out? So straight away, let's go into what was the Batman game scene before Arkham Asylum. Well, I'm sure plenty of you watching this are aware, but before the game came out, there were plans for another Batman game to come out based on the Dark Knight movie. However, the studio making that actually shut down, meaning of course they can't make the game. Then Rocksteady Rocksteady's parent company were then, which I believe was Eidos Entertainment, something like that, and they then got the rights to make a Batman game. And once Rocksteady started working on this and showed the prototype, they were then given permission to keep working on the game. Now, the game would release in 2009, and almost immediately it was met very, very well by fans and critics, because before then, Batman games it was very rare that they'd actually be of decent quality. Of course, just like most superheroes, there was games on the arcades and stuff like that, but of course, in comparison to games we have today, all of those will seem bad, even if they're classic. None of which of the Batman ones were particularly good, especially heading into PS1, PS2. None of those Batman games really stood out, and none of them were that great. But here, on the PS3 and the Xbox 360, came Batman Arkham Asylum. Now this game was crazy because of its different mechanics, its story. Literally everything about this game was different to what had come before, but in the best way possible. So now that we've talked about what it was like before this game came out, let's actually talk about the game itself. So we already discussed the game came out in 2009, and this game had a lot of features that made it stand out, not just from all the other Batman games, but also just in general amongst all these other games. And a lot of people will talk about the stealth and the combat, and I definitely will. And firstly, because it's the smallest part of the game, at least in this one, I want to talk about the traversal. So in this game, there isn't actually that much of it, but Batman of course has his cape, which you can actually use to glide around the island. Now, it's not as advanced as it would become in the later games. However, it is pretty impressive, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware, some guy spent, I think it was 2 years working on the cape, and it really shows. It looks really good, the noises it makes, you know, when you're gliding around, even when you're like stunning opponents. It sounds really good and it sounds pretty realistic, at least for a game in 2009. It sounds pretty damn good, right? Now, stealth and combat, these two have actually been, I wouldn't say stolen, but they've been used by like a bunch of other games since then as well, even games that a lot of people in my comments seem to want me to cover, like the Spider-Man games. They have, I'm not saying they're copying Batman Arkham's combat, because that's not the case. However, they have very similar combat, and I think you could say it might be inspired by Arkham combat, which there's nothing wrong with that, of course. If you find something that you really, really like, what's the point in, you know, making something completely different when you think you can, you know, improve on it? And of course, it's up to you whether you think Spider-Man combat is better than Arkham combat. It really comes down to personal preference, but this series, and especially Asylum, influenced a lot of what other games are doing today. Now, when it comes to stealth and combat, they were very revolutionary at the time, because not a lot of games had done a system like how, you know, this game was doing it. And in stealth, which we'll go into first, I'm going to do a brief explanation. I'm sure all of you know what stealth mode is, but for those who, you know, maybe are wanting to get into the series, you haven't played the games yet, what stealth basically is Batman has a detective mode, which basically shows the skeletons of all of your enemies, and if they're in blue, it means they're unarmed. You can just drop down, you know, pick them up. But if they're red, it means they're armed, of course, meaning you can't just drop down and attack, because you'll get shot and you'll die. This is very helpful. However, one thing we'll talk about later in the weaknesses is that you're going to be spending a lot of the game in detective mode, when this game is actually pretty beautiful. It looks really nice. So of course, that's not great, because they've spent a whole lot of time making the world for this game. Even though it's the smallest world, it still looks great, but you're going to be spending a lot of time in detective mode, which makes everything like a dark blue color, so you're not going to get to see the open world, you know, for all its beauty, which is very unfortunate. Now, that's basically what stealth is, in a very simple way of explaining it. Now, when it comes to I just said stealth. When it comes to combat, they use a free flow system, which basically just means while pressing one button and aiming your joystick, you go from one enemy to another, you know, just hitting them in the face, which is pretty funny, I will say, but it's also very satisfying to do, even though you're only clicking one button. And some people might say it's button mashy, but I feel like when you get on to the later games, and even in this game, once you start getting into, you know, you start getting further into the story, it becomes less button mashy, because you have a lot more enemies you have to deal with. And it's not just mashing, you actually have to have some level of skill in this game, I feel, at least towards the end. And in the later games, you definitely need, you know, a degree of skill, because you're going to be coming up against a bunch of enemies, which of course a lot of those started in this game. Now, what are some of the weaknesses and positives of this game? Well, as I said before, we'll start with weaknesses, and it's that you're spending a lot of time in detective mode. Now, the mode's very, very helpful in stealth gameplay, but what I would actually recommend for you guys is, if you don't need to be in detective mode, don't be in it, because you're going to miss out on a lot of cool little details. Even though detective mode reveals a lot of things, if you're not following a trail or checking to see, you know, if there's people, like armed people around, once you figure out, like, if there isn't any around, I would suggest turning it off. Just explore the world a little bit, because yes, this is the smallest world in any Arkham game, but it's one of the prettiest, I would argue. And well, yeah, it's graphically not amazing technically by today's standards. Keep in mind, this game came out over 10 years ago, right? So it looks pretty damn amazing. Now, another weakness that I've covered a lot on this channel is the boss fights. The gameplay in this game, I would argue, is amazing, but it doesn't have the best boss fights, which can be forgiven because they were actually a late addition. So I'm not gonna, you know, criticize them too heavily for that. Now, another negative I would say is actually the story. the story is probably the weakest part of this game, and it's not because it's terribly written by any means, it's just because I don't find it to be that entertaining. I think it's easily the most boring story in the Arkham games. I don't think it's the worst written, but I think in terms of story, it just isn't anything special. And the usage of the Titans in this game was too much. They overused them quite a bit, which it didn't annoy me, but I felt like it was sort of unnecessary, especially towards the end. And my biggest gripe with this game is the final boss fight. I don't think it was too out of character for Joker to, become a Titan. It kind of makes sense, but at the same time, I think the story isn't the issue in terms of that ending. I just think it's the gameplay, because it doesn't test what you've learned throughout the game. You're just doing, it feels like it could be a boss that you do in the first sort of 40 minutes. Like, aside from like the build up to it, and of course just like the whole, like where the fight takes place and like the atmosphere of it is amazing, but the fight is all wrong. And speaking of atmosphere, that is the first thing I want to talk about for the positives. This game has the best atmosphere in the whole series, and if you disagree, that's perfectly fine. As always, I completely, it's 100% okay if you disagree with me, as long as you're respectful about it in the comments. But I think it's unmatched because it's very claustrophobic. It feels like a horror game at times, which personally, as someone who does not really like horror games due to getting scared of them, I think that a game like this is perfect for me because I love the dark sort of atmosphere that comes with horror games, but I hate getting really scared. So having that sort of middle ground has always been something that makes me come back to this game a lot. Another thing I really like is the character dynamics. We have a lot of iconic Batman villains here, Scarecrow, Killer Croc, Poison Ivy, Harley Quinn, of course the Joker. I probably missed some really important ones just there, but you get the point. All of the villains in this game are very iconic. Most of them, a casual Batman fan would know of. Now, of course, Kevin Conroy as Batman, he will always be Batman. He will always be the definitive Batman, and his performance along with Mark Hamill as the Joker are easily the best in the game. They do probably have the most, they do actually have the most lines in the game, so it might not be fair, but I think even if they had less than everyone else, they'd still be the best because they're both amazing voice actors. Now, another thing that I really like that, we already really covered, but the stealth, combat, just the gameplay in general is actually a really, really big, I would say, selling point for this game, because this game had a lot to live up to because all the other games, not all, but most of the other Batman games made before this weren't good. So, making gameplay, making a story, adding in all these iconic characters really, really worked in my opinion, and I think that the gameplay might have been the biggest selling point of the whole game. Alright, now the final thing to talk about is how the game holds up now as of recording this, the very start of 2024. So, this game is often put at the bottom of most people's list because it has the least amount of content. It's the least, I suppose, refined. It is definitely the game with the least amount of content. The gameplay is probably, not even probably, it is the weakest in the whole series. And things like that, and again, things like the Titans, the bad final boss, often is why people have it as the worst game. And while I understand this, personally, I don't think this is a reason to have it as the worst game. So I assume a few of you might have seen my video on the Batman Arkham games ranked, and if you did, you would have seen that I actually have Arkham Asylum as my favorite game in the series, and that is ultimately why I'm making this video. I think that this game is incredible for all of the reasons that I just told you, and while, all the other games have a lot more going on, there's things like side missions, a much bigger map, better graphics, probably a better story, aside from maybe night, and sure, this game has the least going on, but I would argue that this game has something that all the other games don't have, and I can't quite put my finger on how to explain it to you guys, but if you've played the game, I'm sure you might sort of know what I mean. Even if it's not your favorite in the series, you might have a reason why you think it's the best. It could be nostalgia, you know, certain memories to do with the game, or you might genuinely just really enjoy the game for what it is and think that, you know, while the other Arkham games are great, and of course my channel is mainly based on the Arkham games, so of course I love all the other games. However, I think that none of them are able to beat Arkham Asylum, and even if they continue to make Arkham games in the future, which it sounds like is a possibility, I don't think any of them will be able to pass Batman Arkham Asylum. With all that being said, guys, that is probably the longest video I've ever made. So it's around 15 minutes, I think, as of recording this. So I'll try to make the outro sort of short, but I want to thank all of you for watching. Again, please go leave some questions in the community tab. I really appreciate all of the support recently. Thank you to anyone, you know, new that watches this video. I don't talk as much in the beginning of the videos, so, or at least in all my other videos, I don't really talk that much. I usually head straight into the videos, so I'm sorry you had to hear all that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and the next video should be on Batman Arkham, or it'll be the Q&A video, so stay tuned. Thank you guys.